France, August 1944. A Sherman tank from the 2nd Armored Division is moving through a narrow village street in Normandy. The street is wide enough for one vehicle, stone walls on both sides. Visibility forward, approximately 40 meters. The commander is in the turret with his hatch open because closed hatches reduce visibility to almost zero, and reduced visibility in a village means you die without seeing why. Around a corner, 30 meters ahead, a German Panzer IV appears, moving in the opposite direction. Both crews see each other at the same moment. What happens in the next 4 seconds determines who lives and who does not. Not tactics, not training, not the quality of the armor plate on either vehicle. 4 seconds. The crew that completes the sequence of acquiring the target, rotating the turret to bearing, loading a round if the breech is empty, and firing first, wins. The crew that completes that sequence second does not. The Sherman fires first. The Panzer IV is hit at 30 meters. The round penetrates the front plate, passes through the fighting compartment, and exits through the rear. The Panzer IV stops. It does not explode immediately. It sits in the street. None of the 5 men inside survive. The Sherman crew survives, not because their tank was better. The Panzer IV had comparable armor and a comparable gun at that range. They survive because their gunner completed the firing sequence approximately 1.5 seconds faster than the German gunner. 1.5 seconds is the entire margin between the living and the dead in this engagement. This is what close-range tank combat actually was. Not the long-distance duels that dominate the popular imagination of armored warfare. Not tigers on open steppe engaging at 2,000 meters. The majority of tank versus tank engagements in World War II took place at ranges under 500 meters. A significant percentage took place at ranges under 100 meters. Less. The variables that mattered most, less. The variables that mattered most were crew training, crew communication, the physical layout of the fighting compartment, and a factor that no engineer could design for and no commander could train into his men: the specific sequence of events in the 4 to 8 seconds after first visual contact. The popular image of World War II tank combat is shaped by a small number of engagements that were genuinely fought at long range. The Battle of Prokhorovka on the Eastern Front in July 1943. The tank battles in the open desert of North Africa. Engagements on the flat plains of northern Germany in 1945, where visibility stretched to 2 kilometers and tanks could engage at ranges where the curvature of the earth began to be a factor in ballistic calculations. These engagements happened. They are well documented, and they are not representative of how most tank crews died. The majority of armored combat in World War II took place in conditions that severely restricted visibility and therefore engagement range. Northwestern Europe in 1944 and 1945 was defined by the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, where individual fields were enclosed by earthen banks topped with thick vegetation that had been growing undisturbed for centuries. A tank moving through bocage could not see more than 50 to 100 meters in most directions. The hedgerows were too thick to see through, and in many cases too strong to drive through without specialized equipment. Italy was mountains, river crossings, and medieval villages with streets designed for donkey carts, not 30-ton armored vehicles. The Eastern Front, despite its reputation for open terrain, included enormous stretches of forest, urban areas, and river valleys, where visibility was as restricted as anywhere in Western Europe. The Pacific had jungle. Even the North African desert, which seems from maps to offer unlimited visibility, had wadis and ridgelines and dust storms that reduced effective engagement range to a few hundred meters for significant periods. A study conducted by the US Army after the war analyzed the engagement ranges reported in after-action reports from armored units in Northwest Europe. The findings were consistent and somewhat surprising to planners who had designed tanks with longer-range engagements in mind. Approximately 75% of all tank versus tank engagements in Northwest Europe took place at ranges of 500 meters or less. Approximately 40% took place at ranges of 200 meters or less. A significant number took place at ranges where the crews could hear each other if the hatches were open. At these ranges, the ballistic performance advantages of larger guns became largely irrelevant. A 75mm gun and an 88mm gun both penetrated the armor of most opposing tanks at ranges under 300 meters. The question was not whether a hit would penetrate. The question was which crew achieved a hit first. And that question was answered not by the specifications of the weapon, but by the trained speed of the crew operating it, the layout of the compartment they were operating in, and the fraction of a second decisions made by 5 men in a space the size of a small bathroom. Understanding why close-range tank combat was so lethal requires understanding what an armor-piercing round actually does when it penetrates a steel wall at short distance. The physics are not intuitive, and the popular depiction of tank hits in film and television consistently misrepresents the mechanism of death inside a vehicle that has been penetrated. An armor-piercing round fired from a tank gun at close range arrives at the target moving at between 700 and 900 meters per second, depending on the gun and the ammunition type. That is approximately 2.5 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the round does not simply punch a clean hole through the armor plate and continue in a straight line. What happens instead is a process that takes place in approximately 1 millisecond and involves several distinct mechanisms operating simultaneously. When the round strikes the armor plate, the impact energy is transferred into the plate material faster than the steel can deform elastically. The plate fails locally at the point of impact. Depending on the angle of impact and the relative hardness of the round and the plate, the failure produces either a clean penetration or a partial penetration with spalling. Spalling is the more dangerous outcome for the crew because it means the inner face of the armor plate fragments, and those fragments are accelerated into the interior of the vehicle at high velocity. A round that does not fully penetrate can still kill every person inside by driving steel splinters from the plate itself through the fighting compartment at speeds exceeding 200 meters per second. If the round fully penetrates, it carries with it fragments of the armor plate it has just passed through, now traveling at roughly the same velocity as the round itself. Inside the fighting compartment, which is approximately 2 meters wide and 2 meters tall in a medium tank, these fragments have nowhere to go except into the crew, the ammunition storage, the fuel lines, and the hydraulic systems. The volume of metal moving through the interior of a penetrated tank in the first 1/10 of a second after impact is not one projectile. It is dozens of fragments, ranging from fine splinters to pieces of armor plate several centimeters across, all moving at several hundred meters per second in a space where 5 men are sitting within arm's reach of each other. Ammunition storage is the secondary kill mechanism. Most World War II tanks carried their main gun ammunition in racks inside the fighting compartment, within reach of the loader. When fragments from a penetrating hit struck unprotected ammunition, the propellant charges ignited. The resulting fire and pressure increase inside the sealed compartment was almost always fatal to anyone remaining inside. Crews who recognized the sound and feel of a penetrating hit had approximately 2 to 4 seconds to exit the vehicle before ammunition ignition made exit impossible. 2 to 4 seconds to open a hatch, climb out, and drop clear of a vehicle that may be on fire and that may have its hatches jammed by the same impact that penetrated the armor. To understand the human dimension of close-range tank combat, you need to understand the physical space these men were working in. The fighting compartment of a medium tank in World War II was not designed for the comfort or the escape of its crew. It was designed to fit the minimum number of men required to operate the weapon system into the minimum volume of armored steel. Every cubic centimeter of internal space that was not strictly necessary was weight that reduced mobility and increased target size. In a Sherman M4A3, the standard American medium tank, the fighting compartment measured approximately 2 meters wide, 1.8 meters tall from floor to turret roof, and roughly 2 meters long from the front hull to the rear of the turret basket. 5 men occupied this space. The driver and assistant driver sat in the front hull. The commander, gunner, and loader worked in the turret. The commander's position was highest, in the turret cupola. The gunner sat directly in front of and below the commander, pressed against the gun breech. The loader stood or crouched to the left of the breech, handling rounds that weighed between 6 and 7 kilograms each and were approximately 60 centimeters long. The German Panzer IV had similar internal dimensions and a similar crew arrangement. The Tiger I was larger, but the fighting compartment was not proportionally more spacious because the Tiger carried more equipment and thicker armor. The Soviet T-34 was notably more cramped, with only 4 crew members managing tasks that required 5 in comparable Western designs, and with internal dimensions that made operation physically demanding for anyone of average height or larger. In all of these vehicles, the crew worked in close physical proximity to several immediately lethal hazards simultaneously. Main gun ammunition was stored within arm's reach of the loader and within the fragmentation radius of any penetrating hit. Hydraulic fluid for the gun elevation and turret traverse systems ran in lines through the fighting compartment. In some designs, fuel lines passed through or near the fighting compartment. Electrical wiring for the radio, the gun firing circuit, and the engine systems was routed throughout the interior. When a round penetrated, all of these hazards became active simultaneously. Hydraulic fluid sprang from a severed line ignited on contact with hot metal fragments. Fuel lines that failed fed fires that made the interior of the vehicle unsurvivable within seconds. Electrical shorts from damaged wiring could detonate ammunition directly. The men inside were not simply in danger from the penetrating round itself. They were in danger from the entire system of stored energy inside the vehicle being released simultaneously in an uncontrolled way into a sealed metal container. Hatches were the only escape route. A Sherman had hatches for the driver and assistant driver in the front hull, and a single large hatch in the turret roof for the commander, gunner, and loader. Under normal conditions, opening and exiting through a hatch took approximately 5 to 8 seconds per person. Under combat conditions, with the vehicle possibly on fire, possibly still under fire from the weapon that had just penetrated it, with crew members potentially wounded by the initial hit, and with hatches that may have been jammed by the impact, that time extended significantly. In close-range tank combat, the single most important mechanical variable separating survivors from casualties was turret traverse speed. Not armor thickness, not gun caliber, not engine power. The speed at which a crew could rotate the turret from one bearing to another determined more than any other single factor which tank fired first in an unexpected engagement. And in engagements at ranges under 200 meters, firing first was almost always equivalent to surviving. Turret traverse in World War II tanks was achieved by 2 methods: manual traverse using a hand wheel operated by the gunner, and powered traverse using an electric or hydraulic motor. Both methods had significant limitations that became critical in close-range combat. Manual traverse required the gunner to spin a hand wheel continuously, which was physically demanding and relatively slow. A full 360-degree manual traverse of a Sherman turret took approximately 30 seconds under normal conditions. In an engagement where the target was at 90 degrees from the current gun bearing, that meant 15 seconds to bring the gun on target using manual traverse alone. 15 seconds is an eternity in close combat. A tank moving at 10 kilometers per hour covers 40 meters in 15 seconds. A round fired from 200 meters arrives in approximately 2/10 of a second. 15 seconds of manual turret traverse in a close engagement was not a tactical option. It was a death sentence. Powered traverse solved part of the problem but introduced others. The Sherman's powered traverse system could complete a full rotation in approximately 15 seconds at maximum speed, meaning a 90-degree traverse took roughly 4 seconds. The German Panzer IV used a manual traverse system that was somewhat faster than the Sherman's manual backup, but significantly slower than the Sherman's powered system. The Tiger I had a powered traverse that was slower than the Sherman's because the turret was heavier, requiring more time to accelerate and decelerate. This created a specific tactical reality that experienced crews learned and that inexperienced crews discovered at cost. In an ambush situation where the enemy tank appeared at a significant angle from the current gun bearing, the Sherman crew had a meaningful advantage due to faster powered traverse. In a situation where both tanks were facing each other directly and the engagement was essentially a gun duel at short range, the traverse advantage disappeared, and the outcome was decided by which gunner could acquire the target and fire more quickly. Soviet T-34 crews faced particular difficulties with turret traverse. The two-man turret of early T-34 models required the commander to also serve as the loader, meaning the person responsible for identifying targets, directing the driver, and operating the radio was simultaneously handling heavy ammunition rounds. Under the stress of close combat, this task distribution produced delays in the firing sequence that cost crews their lives. The three-man turret introduced in later T-34 models addressed this problem directly, and crew survival rates improved measurably after the change. Penetration by an armor-piercing round was the primary cause of tank crew casualties in close combat. Fire was the secondary cause, and in many respects the more feared one among the men who lived inside these machines. A penetrating round killed quickly and often without warning. Fire did not always kill quickly, and the men who survived the initial penetration sometimes did not survive the fire that followed it. The relationship between tank design and fire risk was understood by engineers before the war and was the subject of ongoing design effort throughout the conflict. The problem was that the solutions to fire risk were in direct conflict with the solutions to other design requirements. Removing ammunition from the fighting compartment reduced fire risk, but reduced the loader's ability to handle rounds quickly. Moving fuel tanks outside the armored hull reduced fire risk, but increased vulnerability to small arms fire and fragments. Wet stowage systems that surrounded ammunition with a liquid mixture to suppress ignition added weight and reduced the number of rounds carried. The Sherman tank had a particularly poor early reputation for fire among the crews who fought in it, earning the nickname Ronson among Allied soldiers, after the cigarette lighter brand whose advertising slogan was that it lit first time, every time. The nickname was not entirely fair to the design. Early Shermans carried their ammunition in sponson racks on the sides of the hull, in locations that were vulnerable to penetrating hits. Later production Shermans moved the ammunition to a wet stowage arrangement below the turret floor, surrounded by a water and antifreeze mixture. This change measurably reduced the fire rate after penetration. The wet stowage Sherman burned after penetration approximately 15 to 20% of the time, compared to approximately 60 to 80% for the dry stowage versions. German tanks had their own fire vulnerabilities that are less discussed in popular accounts. The Tiger I carried significant fuel capacity in tanks located in the rear hull and sponson areas. The penetrating hit to these areas produced fuel fires that were as lethal as anything the Sherman experienced. The Panther, which had a reputation for mechanical unreliability, had a specific vulnerability in its engine compartment where fuel lines ran near hot exhaust components, producing fires that were not always related to combat damage at all. German tank crews were not fighting in inherently safer vehicles. They were fighting in vehicles with different fire risk profiles that were less systematically documented by the losing side. The Soviet T-34 used a diesel engine rather than the gasoline engines common in German and American tanks. Diesel fuel has a significantly higher flash point than gasoline, meaning it requires more energy to ignite. This gave the T-34 a meaningful advantage in post-penetration fire resistance compared to gasoline-powered vehicles. A T-34 hit by an armor-piercing round was less likely to catch fire than a comparable Sherman or Panzer IV, which contributed to better crew survival rates after penetration in Soviet vehicles, at least in terms of fire specifically. Every variable in close-range tank combat ultimately came back to the crew. Not the crew as 5 individuals, but the crew as a coordinated system that had to perform a specific sequence of actions under extreme stress in a compressed time frame. The difference between crews that survived multiple close engagements and crews that did not was not primarily physical courage. It was the degree to which 5 men had trained together long enough that the communication between them had been reduced to minimum words, and the actions of each member had been practiced to the point where they did not require conscious thought under pressure. The firing sequence in a tank engagement required inputs from 4 of the 5 crew members in rapid succession. The commander identified the target and gave a fire command, including the target type and bearing. The driver adjusted the vehicle position if necessary to bring the gun to bear or to present the strongest armor face to the threat. The gunner traversed the turret, elevated the gun, and acquired the target in the sight. The loader confirmed the correct ammunition type was chambered, opened the breech if necessary, loaded the round, and called ready. The gunner fired. From the commander's first words to the round leaving the barrel, a well-trained crew completed this sequence in 4 to 6 seconds. An average crew required 8 to 12 seconds. An inexperienced crew, under combat stress for the first time, required considerably longer, if they completed the sequence at all. The 4 to 6 second difference between a well-trained crew and an average crew was, in a close engagement, the difference between firing first and firing second. And in engagements under 200 meters, firing second meant receiving a hit before your own round was away. The training investment required to bring a crew to the 4 to 6 second standard was substantial. American armor doctrine called for a minimum of several hundred hours of crew training before combat deployment. In practice, by 1944, replacement crews were often reaching their units with significantly less time together as a team, having trained individually on their respective positions, but not having drilled together as a 5-man system for the hours required to reach reliable combat performance. German armor doctrine placed heavy emphasis on crew cohesion and kept successful crews together as a unit rather than rotating individuals out separately as replacements became necessary. This produced experienced crews with high internal communication efficiency, but it also meant that when a crew was lost, experienced personnel were lost together, rather than being distributed as individual replacements into other units. The Soviet system rotated crews more frequently and suffered from the resulting loss of cohesion, a problem that Soviet commanders documented repeatedly in their operational reports throughout the war. Communication inside the tank during combat added a further layer of complexity. The noise level inside a firing tank was between 130 and 150 decibels. Normal speech was inaudible. All internal communication was conducted through an intercom system, using throat microphones that picked up vibration from the larynx rather than airborne sound. These systems worked under normal conditions and failed with some regularity under combat conditions, when electrical connections were jarred loose by hits or when microphones were damaged. Crews that lost internal communication during a close engagement and had to revert to shouting across a tank interior filled with gunfire noise were effectively operating without coordination. The casualty statistics for armored crews in World War II are less systematically documented than the statistics for infantry or air forces, partly because the records of destroyed vehicles are more complete than the records of individual crew fates. A tank that did not return from a mission was recorded as a loss. Whether the crew died, were captured, or escaped and returned to their unit was often recorded separately and less completely, particularly in the chaos of active operations. With those caveats stated, the available records produce consistent findings across multiple armies and multiple theaters of operation. The U.S. Army analysis of armored casualties in Northwest Europe found that approximately 45% of Sherman crews that experienced a penetrating hit suffered at least one crew member killed or seriously wounded. In engagements that resulted in the vehicle being destroyed rather than damaged and recoverable, the crew fatality rate rose to approximately 65%. These figures mean that in a combat-destroyed Sherman, on average, 3 of the 5 crew members did not survive. German records for the Eastern Front, which are less complete due to the circumstances of the German defeat, indicate comparable or higher crew loss rates in destroyed vehicles. The Tiger I, despite its reputation for near invulnerability, had crew survival rates after vehicle destruction that were not significantly better than those of lighter German tanks, because the greater difficulty of penetrating the armor was offset by the greater energy transferred to the interior when penetration did occur, and by the greater difficulty of exiting the vehicle quickly through hatches designed for a very heavy turret. Soviet records for T-34 crews are the most extensively studied, partly because of the scale of Soviet armored losses, and partly because of the post-war Soviet interest in analyzing the performance of their most important weapon system. The findings show that T-34 crew fatality rates in destroyed vehicles were somewhat lower than comparable German rates, consistent with the diesel fuel advantage and with design choices in the T-34 that prioritized crew escape routes to a greater degree than German designs. Even so, in close-range engagements under 200 meters, T-34 crew survival rates after vehicle destruction were below 50%. The specific contribution of range to casualty rates is documented in several post-war analyses. American armor studies found that penetrating hits at ranges under 100 meters resulted in crew fatalities approximately 70% of the time, compared to approximately 45% for hits at ranges between 300 and 500 meters. The difference reflects the higher velocity of the round at close range, which transferred more energy to interior fragments, and the reduced time available to the crew for escape before secondary fires developed. One additional data point from the American armor studies is consistently cited because it illustrates the range problem clearly. Of all Sherman tanks destroyed in combat in Northwest Europe, approximately 60% were destroyed by hits to the front or side at ranges under 300 meters. Engagements at ranges greater than 500 meters accounted for approximately 15% of combat losses. The long-range engagements that dominate the popular imagination of tank warfare accounted for a relatively small fraction of the actual deaths. The close engagements, that are less dramatic and less photographed, accounted for most of them. Every army that fought with tanks in World War II understood the close-range problem. Every army attempted to address it through some combination of design changes, tactical doctrine, and crew training. None of them solved it. Understanding why they could not solve it explains why the casualty rates remained what they were from the beginning of the war to the end, despite significant improvements in tank design, crew training, and tactical doctrine over 6 years of combat experience. The design approaches to reducing close-range vulnerability all involved trade-offs that made the solutions self-limiting. Increasing armor thickness reduced the probability of penetration at close range, but added weight, which reduced mobility and increased ground pressure. A tank heavy enough to be genuinely resistant to close-range fire from the weapons it was likely to encounter became too heavy to cross most bridges, bogged in soft ground that lighter vehicles crossed without difficulty, and consumed fuel at rates that complicated logistics. The Tiger I represented approximately the upper limit of what could be practically fielded given the road and bridge infrastructure of World War II Europe. Vehicles heavier than the Tiger were designed, and some were built, but none were fielded in significant numbers because they could not be moved to where they were needed. Improving escape routes was another avenue that designers explored. Increasing the number of hatches, making hatches easier to open under combat conditions, and positioning hatches away from areas likely to be damaged by penetrating hits, all had merit. But hatches were also weak points in the armor envelope. Every hatch was a location where the armor was thinner, or where the seal between the hatch and the hull created a potential path for fragments. Designers adding escape hatches were simultaneously adding vulnerability. The trade-off was real, and it limited how far the escape route improvements could go. Removing ammunition from the fighting compartment, which the wet stowage Sherman partially achieved, was among the more effective design responses, and it produced measurable improvements in post-penetration fire rates. But it could not be taken to the logical extreme of storing all ammunition outside the fighting compartment entirely, because that would have made loading too slow to be practical in combat. The loader had to be able to reach the ammunition quickly. Quickly meant nearby. Nearby meant inside the armored envelope with the crew. Tactical doctrine attempted to reduce close engagements through combined arms operations, using infantry to screen tanks in close terrain where ambush was likely. This worked when it was applied correctly. It was not always applied correctly, and the terrain conditions that produced close engagements, bocage, urban areas, forest, were precisely the conditions where maintaining close infantry armor coordination was most difficult. Infantry and tanks moved at different speeds, communicated through different systems, and had different instincts about where the threat was and how to respond to it. The breakdowns in combined arms coordination that sent individual tanks into close terrain without infantry support were not failures of doctrine. They were failures of execution under the conditions of real combat, where nothing goes as planned, and the gap between doctrine and reality is measured in dead crews. You did not think about the odds. You could not afford to think about the odds. You trained to do the job in the shortest possible time, and you hoped that your training was better than the other man's training. That was all there was. The tank did not care about your feelings on the subject. Sergeant Frank Woolner, 4th Armored Division, U.S. Army, from a 1978 interview. The close-range problem could not be designed away because it was not fundamentally a design problem. It was a geometry problem. Terrain that restricted visibility to under 100 meters existed on every front, in every theater, in every year of the war. As long as tanks were required to operate in that terrain, the engagements it produced were going to happen. And in those engagements, at those ranges, the physics produced the outcomes they produced. The engineers did what they could. The terrain did not cooperate. At under 100 meters, armor meant almost nothing. Why close-range tank combat had almost no survivors.